Welcome to CBSR's first webinar of 2021, entitled Leadership Trends for 2021. My name is Lior Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of CBSR. Such a pleasure to have all of you joining us, and we've got an amazing program and some terrific guest speakers joining us for this webinar that I'll introduce in a moment here. I just want to acknowledge first that if you're just joining us, we did put a link in the chat box to a link that is native-land.ca. I encourage you to look up what traditional Indigenous territory you are joining us from right now. And I wanted to do a land acknowledgement to kick us off here and let you know that I'm joining you today from Mohkinsis, which is the Blackfoot name for the place that we now call Calgary. This is Treaty 7 territory and the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. The city of Calgary is also home to the historic Northwest Métis and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. The reason that I think a land acknowledgement is so important to kick things off here is, and when I think about this, I think of, I have a new daughter, 4-month-old, and it'll be many years until she understands the full context in which she's born into. But one day I hope she'll know the story of her parents, the Holocaust story of her ancestors, the story of the land that they immigrated to, so that she can know the full context, the full story of the place where they're from and the land that or the place that she's from, and the land that she is born into. And in truth, I'm still learning that story. I've learned that there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to unlearn, and I'm walking that journey. I hope that many of you are also on that journey or will join in that journey, because I've really come to see land acknowledgement as a chance to open dialogue, as an introspection about how things came to be and how to build a shared future. It's an opportunity to heal, to express gratitude, and to inspire some change. I certainly feel privileged to be a guest on Treaty 7, to build a family here, and to enjoy my health, even in the midst of a devastating health emergency. I know that doing a land acknowledgement doesn't suddenly mean that truth and reconciliation has been achieved, but I do believe it's one baby step toward a multi-generational journey that we're all on together to make us all whole. So thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for joining us today and for being part of the acknowledgement. The reason that we're holding this webinar is really to set a tone for the year ahead. These are what we believe are the business leadership issues that will define 2021. And 2020, the year that we just closed the chapter on, was a really strange and difficult year for everybody, for sure. But CBSR also experienced unprecedented growth in 2020. We actually saw 300% growth in our membership. And it's in large part thanks to the successful partnership that we established with the constellation that includes Globe and the Delphi Group. And our experience with so many of the country's leading companies gives us insight into the business leadership challenges in the year ahead. But we didn't want to only present our observations of our work with the companies that we've been working with over the last year. We're fortunate to have a really close relationship with GlobeScan, because the CEO of GlobeScan is an inspiring person who also happens to be the chair of our board. And we're fortunate to have him here to provide some quantitative data about what Canadians expect from business leaders in the year ahead. It's fitting that we're talking about leadership, because on the same day that we're doing this, there's a changing of the guard in terms of influential leadership south of the border, our largest trading partner. And I think it's a sign of a shifting landscape. And not only will we have some quantitative data that will be put forward in this meeting here, but we'll hear from two highly regarded business leaders from two of Canada's most iconic companies. And these are companies that we're also really proud to call brand new CBSR members. So on that note, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and I'll save the other two introductions shortly, but I'll let you know, and you probably know already, that our speakers here are Chris Coulter, Sandra Odendahl, and Tonya Lagrasta. I'll do a bit more of an introduction for each of them. And first up, we have Chris Coulter, who is the CEO of GlobeScan. He brings 2 decades of experience in providing evidence-based counsel to leadership organizations around the world to help them better understand and respond to shifting stakeholder expectations and build trust with key stakeholders and exert greater influence in shaping the future. Chris is the chair of Canadian Business for Social Responsibility, as I already mentioned, and he co-authored the book, All In, The Future of Business Leadership. So I think he's a fitting person to give us a snapshot of what that business leadership looks like. Chris.
Thank you so much, Lior, and thanks everybody for joining. And it is nice to kick off the year with this convening that we're all doing together, and hopefully have a good chance for some questions and that little Q&A to get the discussion, because I want to hear from Sandra and Tonya's perspectives for sure. But as Lior said, my role here is to share a bit of research that we've done that is meant to give a sense of what the new normal is beginning to look like as we've gone through this incredible disruption and transformation, which is multifaceted, right? Of course, there's the COVID crisis that we're experiencing. We're experiencing economic dislocation as part of that, but also part of an ongoing trend. We have an ongoing climate crisis. We have a big COP26 coming up, where there'll be lots of momentum related to it going forward. And we have an inequality crisis that has also been amplified and magnified. So a lot of stuff on the table, a lot of issues we're trying to manage. And I think all of us are trying to understand, where is the sand settling and what does all this mean, especially for sustainable development and the role of companies within that conversation. So I'll share a bit of research that gives a little taste for that. So first, let's talk about some public opinion research. So we've been doing an annual public opinion survey across the world for 20 years, and this one took place in June. So it's kind of deep into COVID, and it's trying to answer the question of how have things shifted and changed, and what are expectations for business in particular looking like. So these are Canadian results. 1,000 Canadians were surveyed, as well as 27,000 other people across the world. But these are all Canadian results, which haven't been shared, I don't think, anywhere. And we ask people every year, how much do they view certain problems, and what does that look like? And you can see that 64% of Canadians said that the COVID-19 virus was a very serious issue. So that is like the ceiling. It doesn't get much higher than that, apart from a nuclear war. So if that's the ceiling, then just below that, we have 56% of Canadians saying climate change is a very serious issue, 56% of Canadians saying extreme poverty is a very serious issue, and 55% of us saying depletion of natural resources like deforestation is a very serious issue. So we have been able, through this crisis, as Canadians and people across the world, to manage a number of crises at the same time and keep that sort of urgency. So it's not an either or. And in some ways, I think we're starting to see more sense of how these things are interconnected in many ways. When it comes to climate, through this crisis, we have seen a slow but steady increase in the percentage of Canadians saying climate change is a serious issue. So before the Paris Agreement in 2015, we polled Canadians, and there were 79% of us that thought it was a serious issue. Now there's 87%, a slow but gradual increase in the context of economic dislocation, inequality issues, and the COVID crisis. For comparison, because Lior referenced the inauguration today, the same chart for Americans is a 20-point increase. So Americans were very much outliers when it comes to climate change across the world, and now they've caught up to a certain extent to the rest of global opinion on how serious an issue of climate is. But it's not just climate, of course, and this is an interesting question we asked this year to retail investors. So those among us who have investments directly or indirectly in pension funds or play in the market a little bit, and the 30 or 40% of us have that level of investment profile. And when we ask investors, do you agree or disagree that, first of all, one of the biggest risks facing investors is economic inequality? 73% of retail investors say, yep. And 20 points fewer, only 53% say the same with climate change, which was shocking given the conversations that we've had so far collectively around ESG being dominated by climate issues and TCFD and all the different regulatory infrastructure elements related to climate. And yet there's an instinct from us as people who kind of dabble in the market that inequality is an even bigger risk. So this has been an interesting thing to watch as we go forward. We also asked Canadians and people around the world, as we're trying to dig out and restructure and build the economy back after the crisis, should we get back to normal as soon as possible? And 41% of us think that's what we should do. Or should we restructure the economy so it deals better with things like climate and inequality? And 59% of us opt for that. So that's a pretty big schism between 60-40 split across the country. We're much bolder than Americans and even some Europeans when it comes to this, and certainly folks in Asia. And you can see the demographic difference is startling. And for the first time, we are seeing very dramatic differences between the Gen Z cohorts, the youngest adults among us, versus others and even millennials. And this is a consistent theme in some of the research. So there's a demand and a thirst for greater transformation and addressing some of these issues among the youngest adults compared to some of us older folks who've been around for a while. And then there's this really fascinating attitudinal shift that we picked up that was quite startling across the world. So in the span of 12 months between June 2019 and June 2020, we see a significant, in that time period, rise on a couple of dimensions related to how people are viewing the sustainability agenda. So there's been a 4-point increase in us to say that we think we have to consume less to preserve future generations. So a sense that our consumption patterns are out of whack. There's an 8-point increase among us that say we want to reduce the impact we have on the environment and nature by a large amount. So that's an important reflection as we've been locked into a COVID perspective. There's a slight increase in people saying they want to be more engaged with purposeful brands. And then finally, the most disturbing and interesting finding is that there's been a very significant 14-point increase in people saying what's good for me is not good for the environment. So there's inherent trade-off that we're increasingly seeing on things that I want, things that I desire. It comes with a negative externality around the environment, which is a challenge and probably a good reflection as we've gone through the COVID, but it's also a huge opportunity for companies and brands to try and solve that problem for us, right? To showcase we can actually have things that we want, be delighted and desire are things in our lives materially or experientially, and do it in a way that actually facilitates progress on the sustainability agenda. Finally, we see the public also giving increasing marks for all kinds of sectors across the economy in the last couple of years when it comes to performing responsibilities to society. So there's a big gap between agricultural, healthcare, food tech companies at the top, and then tobacco, oil, mining companies at the bottom. And that's a normal sort of display of different perceptions of sectors, but all the green arrows show this swoop up. So through the COVID crisis, we've got increased demands, expectations, yet we also are seeing business performing better than it was last year. So there's an opportunity to maintain some of that momentum. I'll quickly shift from the general public to some expert research that we do a couple of times a year with our partners at Sustainability. So this is a global panel of experts across the world. This also took place in June 2020, and we asked these experts from business, civil society, academia, and government their views on issues and leadership. And like the general public, we are seeing experts focusing on a whole bunch of different issues with certain levels. But what's remarkable are the pink bars. And this shows the increase between 2019 and 2020 on perceived urgency of these issues to address the sustainability agenda. And it's the biggest explosion of urgency we've seen in tracking these experts over the years. And these are already people who are quite deep into the sustainability agenda, so they are inflamed in their sense of acute focus on some of these issues. The hierarchy is climate, biodiversity, water, then poverty. But all of the biggest increases speak to the inequality agenda: economic inequality, access to healthcare, access to education, gender inequality. All these things are the highest levels of increases of concerns across the expert panel. And then finally, we are also seeing a subtle, but we think important shift in stakeholder expectations for corporate leadership. And this is a response list of why they point to certain companies as leaders, which has Unilever consistently as viewed as the leading company on sustainability across the world. But the aggregate of all those 250 companies that are mentioned by experts as leaders, they are saying increasingly it's about their core business model and their strategy, and pivoting that business model into ways that reflect a sustainable economy. It's about increasingly levels of ambition around targets and commitments. And we've seen an inflation, I think, of those remarkable announcements last year that have driven that. And then we're seeing a decline a little bit on this notion of being purposeful or expressing your values, which I think feels like we might have hit a peak purpose, conversation from a stakeholder audience. It's not a bad thing, it's still important. But I think we've transitioned from that signaling, this is important, to now we've got a greater mainstream understanding, this really matters. Now let's execute, which where we got business model conversations, targets, and things like that that are really critical. So I'll just end by saying, yeah, COVID, yeah, I mean, holy cow, yes. But we also are able to juggle other very acute issues like climate and inequality. We have seemed to have gone collectively under a reevaluation of what matters and what's important to us, and that's heightened the expectation and valuing of sustainability and sustainable development. We're seeing more trust for business and also more interest from consumers and stakeholders to think of what business is doing in the space. And all of this adds up to a couple of important points that I'm sure Tonya and Sandra will build on. But we are at a moment of opportunity for bold systemic action. Easy to say, really hard to do, but that's the name of the game where the expectations are. And there's an opportunity for engaging more deeply and more broadly around sustainability with everybody: consumers, employees, government, investors, all stakeholders. This is game time, and the momentum behind what we're experiencing and seeing, not just in CBSR's ecosystem, as Lior said, but overall in Canada and around the world. So this is a very exciting opportunity. So I'll pause there, Lior.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. I'd like to invite one of our speakers to join the conversation at this point, and both, I guess, react to some of what Chris has laid out as our sort of level setting or context here, but also dive a little bit deeper, because we have two very different companies that are represented here as speakers in two very different industries, but obviously industries that greatly influence the Canadian economy. So let me first pull in Sandra into this conversation. And I'll tell you a little bit about Sandra. She's the Vice President of Social Impact and Sustainability at Scotiabank. She has almost 25 years of experience in environmental science, corporate sustainability, and responsible finance. I think it's in my experience, it's quite rare for such a technical expert to hold such an influential position in a major Canadian bank. So really happy to have her and her perspective here. And Sandra's team develops and implements strategies, policies, and programs to ensure the bank is addressing the environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, topics that matter most to Scotiabank stakeholders. So I'm curious to ask Sandra, what does matter most to the bank's stakeholders? So before I open that to you, let me also just say in acknowledgement, thank you so much for spending your birthday with us, Sandra, and happy birthday to you.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah, I'll have to change that to more than 26 years of experience.
There you go.
Thanks very much, Chris. That was a really great summary of a really insightful, and I'm planning to circulate that inside the bank because you know, just knowing what a wide swath of stakeholders think is really valuable, especially, of course, for the sector that we're in, where and stakeholders. Well, I guess happy to report it's very aligned to what you just heard from Chris. I would say in terms of things we're hearing from employees, the top things we're hearing are about a lot about diversity and inclusion. And I was very interested in your insight about the, you know, it was in a different context than employees, but people are giving companies less credit for kind of showing that they understand an issue, and that's almost less important in their perception of what makes a company good. And it's less about the talk and more about the walk, which is appropriate. So we're seeing that in our organization. Where employees are asking questions about what else are we doing on diversity and inclusion, what else are we doing around anti-racism, and I can talk about it later if we have time to get into some specific activities, but it's really generated some really great initiatives and hard targets and pathways to improving the bank's performance in that. And then I think the other two areas, and I think they're very aligned to what we heard from Chris. Obviously, the second one is climate change. Among employees, though, it's probably more broadly around ESG and what does it mean for my business area? What does it mean for my my functional unit? What is ESG? Is that something anyone's actually been looking at in the bank? It's like, yes, don't worry. We actually call it corporate responsibility, but if you want to call it ESG strategy, that's okay too. And then I think the third one, which may be a little bit more unique to banking, but there are analogies in other sectors, is, and again, inside the bank and outside the bank, is responsible use of data, data protection, privacy, stuff like that. It's a very important topic, and certainly in banking, it's paramount. And I guess among investors, the list isn't that different, but I think with investors, we're definitely hearing tons about climate change, especially around targets and, decarbonizing portfolios and stuff like that. A lot around inclusion, diversity and inclusion, race, anti-racism, and then absolutely we're hearing from external investors and other stakeholders about economic inequality. I think that's an issue for our times in society, and you sort of see what happens when you let inequality get too far off the rails. It's not good for anybody.
Yeah.
So those are the biggies.
Thank you for responding or reacting to Chris's comments in highlighting what is front and center for you at Scotiabank. I want to invite you to sort of double click a little further into you mentioned inclusion a few times there in your remarks. So let's dive a little deeper into that. Give us some examples of the kinds of programs or policies or strategies that make up what that sort of shifting landscape looks like from your point of view. And in particular, do you find that what Chris highlighted as the Gen Z generation and some of their concerns, is that something that you're seeing too?
Okay, so in terms of, I'm going to start with your last question. So in terms of whether this resonates more with Gen Z, I mean, we don't have a lot of Gen Zs working in the bank yet, but I will have two of them at home. So I would say absolutely, in my experience among my my teenage and university age kids and their friends. The issues of anti-racism, inclusion of all types, gender and racial in particular, and I'm hearing a lot about that, and I think there's a genuine desire to see more inclusion actually take effect in people, to not just be talking about it forever. In terms of the concrete actions that I've seen and some that I've been very much involved with at the bank, I guess one of the big things was in the summer. Well, basically after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis last summer, of course, there was a global reckoning around anti-Black racism in particular. And what we found at the bank, there was a lot of employees and executives just kind of wondering, oh my God, should we be doing more? And then when we looked around, we realized there was a ton of grassroots activity going on, and Scotiabank is like about 100,000 people. And so there was a lot going on, tons in HR, which is where a lot of D&I stuff originates, but there were a lot of employee resource groups. There were business lines that were looking at their, not just with anti-Black racism, but just with their whole diversity performance, and Sarah saying, let's take another look. Are we actually doing what we think we're doing, or where do we need to do better, et cetera, et cetera. And then in community investment, which my team does oversee directly, we also were taking a look at the extent to which we were supporting this. So what we found though is there's so much great work going on in this big company, but it was actually not actually coordinated. So the senior executives recognized that let's have a shared direction. Let's make sure that we are all working towards a single North Star, and then let and let 1,000 flowers bloom, but at least we all know what the bouquet is going to look like at the end. And so we put together a BIPOC, we called it a very clunky name, BIPOC Inclusion Task Force. So I was tasked to lead this. The problem with being keen about stuff and asking questions and speaking up is after a few minutes, someone says, hey, you should run with this. And you're like, yeah, okay. But it was fantastic. It was an opportunity to pull together a very small group, very tight timeline. And our objective was really to have a strategy for the bank that was essentially, what are we doing in our community? What are we doing in our workplace? And what are we doing in our business? What do we need to know? Like, what are the problems to be solved? What are the targets that we should have? And who is going to start, where are we in terms of getting there? And who's going to be accountable for getting us where we need to go? So we delivered a report to the Enterprise-Wide Inclusion Council in October. And actually, they liked our recommendations on targets around BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that they actually took a look at them and did a bit of a small edit and actually rolled them out as updated enterprise-wide diversity and inclusion targets that apply to a wide range of inclusion populations, not just BIPOC. So that is really the story about one of the big things that happened. And the other thing that's going on in conjunction with that, and also gelling really solidly, is while we've had a top of the house inclusion council chaired by the CEO for a number of years, there's now diversity and inclusion councils in the main business lines and in corporate functions. And so a couple of us are sort of cross-appointed to the enterprise-wide council, as well as the one for our areas. So there's a lot of attention and activity on this topic, and real genuine desire to see progress, and not just I mean, it's good to listen and understand and talk about the issues, and ongoing education, all very important, but now we want to see actual change.
Sandra, a lot there to unpack even further, but I just wanted to comment. I really liked your 1,000 flowers bloom analogy, all leading to a bouquet. I think that's really interesting. And speaking of a culmination of things, I can't help but notice, because it's just so out there, that Scotiabank just launched this new Scotia Rise program, which is a $500 million commitment. this seems kind of hot off the press. So please tell us a little bit more about what that entails.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So in terms of economic resilience, essentially being the area that we identified, ironically, before the pandemic started. In fact, it was literally T-minus 1 week on the job when I attended a preliminary meeting before I joined Scotiabank in November 2019. There was a desire to rethink the strategic direction of especially of community impact, but also what does it look like in terms of broad social, the ways that we make a social impact on, you know, one area, so that we're a little more focused. So we actually looked across, there's no shortage of social and environmental problems to be solved in the world, of course. And we looked at a number of different areas where we knew there was work to be done and where we might have some advantage in terms of a head start or knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, this whole issue of economic inclusion, financial instability, you know, it ties in, it's not exactly the same as, but it overlaps very much with inequality. But it's a bit of a, it overlaps with it. It's not exactly economic or social inequality, but we recognize that economic stability and economic inclusion were actually really big, important topics, both in our Latin American business, the inclusion part especially, and then economic stability and economic mobility in markets like Canada are also a conversation. And then, of course, when the pandemic hit, we'd already started doing our research, our desktop research, our, you know, just digging into the social issues, digging into understanding what leads to economic instability, what things cause people to, you know, kind of fall off the economic ladder. And then the pandemic hit, and it was like, oh, everything, of course, all of society's cracks, you know, in a pandemic. Before, when the times are good, you can paper over these things with like bubble gum and paper clips. But when you have a disaster, as we're living through right now, you realize where all the holes are and where the cracks are, because they start to rip apart. So when we, as we actually continued with the economic inequality and economic resilience research, and it really gelled around the idea that let's find a few things that ladder up to economic resilience and focus on providing, making an impact on them. So the three pillars that we determined are, number one is basically ensuring high school completion and post-secondary of any kind, because of the hard tons of stats on the link between your ability to be employed and completing at least high school and any kind of post-secondary vastly improves your lifetime employment and therefore income stability. And that's a really important conversation, particularly in some of our Latin American markets, but also pockets in Canada. Second pillar is making newcomers feel at home faster. So that's really about, you know, not wanting newcomer dentists, doctors, lawyers, driving an Uber forever. But what does it take to get newcomers on the right track? There's a lot of great stuff out there, government and charitable sector. So we want to actually be helping to move the needle on that as well with partners in those areas. And then the third pillar is removing barriers to career advancement for underrepresented groups. So this is when you think about people who are perhaps already in a job, in a career, but they've got the glass ceiling or the cement ceiling, you know, because of perhaps unconscious bias, perhaps other barriers, some maybe that are their own making and some that are external, but barriers that if those barriers were removed, those people could really soar. So what can we do to support that, particularly among groups that are underrepresented? So we're pretty excited about that. 500 million sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually, you know, this is going to hopefully seed a lot of other contributions of time, resources, and partnerships that will really hopefully make a dent in these things.
Sandra, thank you. I'd like to at this stage pull Tonya into this conversation. Let me introduce her properly before I do. Tonya Lagrasta is the Senior Director of Corporate Social Responsibility at Loblaw Companies Limited. She brings to her role 20 years of environmental and consulting experience, and she's responsible for the development of Loblaw's 2021 CSR strategy. So I thought I'd ask her not only to respond to some of what we're hearing from the context that Chris set for us at the start of this, but also to ask her what kinds of engagement needs to be done in such a large and dynamic and diverse company like Loblaw, which is involved in a number of different industries, where she's sort of developing or implementing a cross-company strategy. So Tonya, welcome and thank you so much for being part of our webinar here. And that really is kind of the first question is how do you go about engaging people to develop a strategy like the one you've been working on?
So thank you for having me. It's tough to follow Chris and Sandra. So I mean, I think not to be redundant or repetitive. I think yes, yes, and yes, right? And to all the things that that they both shared. You know, for us and for me, the exciting thing is that I came into an organization that has a great history of doing a lot of amazing work, lots of amazing projects, initiatives, so much, you know, under the hood. And, you know, for me, where I saw the opportunity was really, you know, to pick up on that theme of doing what matters. And for us, it's really around what matters most and using that as an anchor for us. Again, to what you alluded to, you know, we, you know, I sit at the enterprise level overseeing a vast array of businesses from grocery to, you know, apparel, fashion, drug retail, and you know, even a financial institution in the mix there. So, you know, what matters most can look very different because the depth and breadth of what we do, what we deliver, and who engages with us. You know, I wanted to just maybe call out themes that we've seen really bubble to the top. And so I think, you know, the silver lining one, I'm a shameless optimist. So I've found lots of silver linings with the COVID pandemic. You know, this way of communicating with humility and transparency really did emerge. And you saw the organizations who were doing that in different ways, really opening up a different line of communication with their stakeholders, everything from employees, shareholders, as well as you know, our customer base. And that was really important, especially as we were navigating our way through something we'd never experienced before. So communicating differently was a big theme and moment that I'm excited to bring forward into kind of the world of environmental and social responsibility, because over the course of my career, I've tended to find that companies don't really like to talk too much about what they don't know. And as they figure their way through things, it's more of a, maybe we should just hold our cards and wait until we've got something significant. And these wicked problems are just far too complex for anyone. So humility, transparency, big theme. The other thing that we're seeing too is kind of this continued and heightened expectation for us to deliver quality, safety. We're seeing a huge expectation, again, not a shift in the things that we should be focusing on, but more of a evolutionary expectation. So people are looking for more of that transformative change to be taking place. You know, choice. You know, for me, I think the future really is about choice and offering that to all of our stakeholders. And then kind of that accountability theme is also really coming up. So great, you said you believe in this. This is your purpose. For us, our purpose is to help Canadians live life well. Great. What does that mean? What does that look like? Can I feel and touch it? And how can you kind of prove to me how how are you holding yourselves accountable, or how can I hold you accountable for doing the things that you're saying you're going to do? And so I would say across kind of our employees and our customers, and we're in this interesting position where sometimes our customers are our employees and sometimes our employees are our customers, et cetera, as well as our shareholders. So it's hard to put them all in their own unique buckets, like some others might be able to, but I would say those are kind of the consistent themes, all laddering up to us being able to make a difference and make an impact where it matters most.
Thank you for that, Tonya. Some of the themes that you're sharing, would you say that they're consistent across the employees that are your stakeholders and staff members, as well as the investors, or are they vastly different needs?
You know, I think they are the same. I'm not seeing a huge distinction between those groups, and I think, you know, perhaps that has a lot to do with the fact that our employees and our customers really do cover that generational horizon that Chris alluded to, right? Everything from the boomers to the Gen Z. You know, we have a lot of Gen Zers, if that's how you what you call them, you know, working in our stores and going to school, and many of them are in post-grad, and they're, you know, back in the day when I walked on campus, us, you know, social impact environmental folks were at the way end of the campus and not near the business school. But you can't walk onto a campus these days or enter any room without this being part of the conversation. So for us, again, going back to that communication piece, is how do we make sure that we maintain that kind of two-way conversation with our employees, because the stores are busier now than ever in the retail space, and they want to know what we're doing. And again, one, because they're passionate interest and there's a degree of pride to know they're working for an organization that walks the talk. But again, in terms of that accountability, if they're not seeing it come to life in their day-to-day job, whether it's store support, distribution, in the store, they're sending us notes, they're calling us out, they're using the channels available, and they want to know what we're doing.
Tonya, you talked about the fact that your business is so diverse. There's the, you know, through Shoppers Drug Mart, you're the country's largest pharmacy company, but many people will know Loblaw because they have a intimate shopping experience with the Loblaw stores across the country. And this past year, I think people saw the sort of food retail business in a whole new way. It essentially is an essential service for all of us. So can you talk a little bit about how has that sort of mindset influenced some of the positioning or sort of leadership that the company sees itself taking, and just in case that's not enough, there to also sort of ask, like, what is kind of the larger trend that you see happening in that part of the business, in the food retail business?
So I think, again, to pick up and continue that transparency theme, you know, one of our conversations around food insecurity and the conversations that I've been having internally around, you know, where do we need to lean in, right? And you know, we've typically leaned in on certain issues for certain reasons. Do we need to do that differently, right, to be able to make that impact where it matters most? And when I look at food and how that played out in the kind of that social context, you know, I think, without getting too far into the weeds on poverty and food insecurity, I think the pandemic was the first time in a very long time that all Canadians, whether or not you could afford or couldn't afford it, everyone had a sense of food insecurity. This is for like, you know, across the board, what we saw. And so an opportunity to continue to focus our conversations and our efforts around supporting a local sustainable food future, and recognizing and helping to bring awareness to the complexity that is the supply chain, how that does impact, and not to take, kind of overreact and say, only Canada, but recognizing that there is a significant opportunity for us to continue to contribute to a sustainable food future. We don't, our relationship and our future is dependent on that. And I think there was a lot of, again, to the theme earlier shared, a lot of vulnerability exposed when it came to food and the role that food retailers and drug retailers play in our everyday lives.
I just took a quick glance, Tonya, in the chat box, and I see a really good question there around metrics. Are there any new metrics that are being considered with some of the disclosure that relates to some of what you're talking about? And I guess generally, what kind of metrics are being used to measure the effectiveness on some of the things you're talking about, like food insecurity?
Sure. So, I mean, I think we're on a significant ESG disclosure journey. And I love what Sandra had called out: CSR, ESG, sustainability. We're all calling it different things. I think, rather than dying on that hill, we can all agree we're in the same arena. We're generally playing a sport, and we're all kind of doing it in slightly different ways. But for us, with a great deal of intentionality, we are focusing on leveraging these ESG frameworks that are, I won't say universally, but there's a very strong consensus that these frameworks can be used as tools to help hold ourselves accountable. And that, without getting into the details of what specific metrics, we are looking at those tools and those frameworks. This year we released our first Sasby report for the grocery retail business. So we're really proud of that. These are really, for those of us who are involved in this, these are really big milestones for organizations when it comes to talking about non-financials in a way that they've never been expected to. And now, again, across the board from all of our stakeholders, to some degree, there's an expectation that we are transparent. So we have been working in every corner of the business to find that healthy point of friction, to challenge the business to be, meet them where they're at, and then help them be the best version of themselves, and then find the right metric as guided by the frameworks to tell that story.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And I want to pivot us a little bit again here, and really invite Chris, Sandra, and yourself, Tonya, to stay close to the mic, because I have invited a couple of folks that saw in the registration list to ask some questions. So I'm going to invite two people to actually ask the three of you a question directly. And we're a bit pressed for time here, so please try and keep your responses really short and succinct. But let me just very quickly here introduce the two people that we've invited. So the first one is Haley Glass, and Haley is the sustainability analyst at Gibson Energy. And Gibson is a company that has been a CBSR member for about a year, so one that we're very familiar with and happy to be working with. Haley, I'm going to invite you to ask your question, but then I'm going to also invite Hiroshi to step forward as well, and so that we can get both questions out, and then in the remaining time we have, try and address both of these. But the other person that I'd like to invite is Hiroshi Amarasinghe. And Hiroshi is responsible for marketing at Ulula. which is another CBSR member, but a unique one because they're a brand new member, part of the new SME or small medium-sized enterprise cohort that CBSR just launched this last fall. And I see that there's a few others who are part of that program and other members online. Jamie, I see you there. Thanks. Wonderful to see so many of our members joining us here. But let me just invite those two folks to ask their question, and let's try and, again, keep it succinct. So Haley, you go first.
Thanks, Lior, and thanks to all the speakers for the great discussion. I was hoping you can share your insight on how you've built internal understanding on ESG or corporate sustainability or whatever you call it. Like, what have you found gets internal stakeholders involved in the various priorities beyond just the leadership level?
Great
That's
question.
a really good question. Yeah.
Before you respond, I'm just going to also invite Aroshi to ask her question, and let's put both out there so that we can try and again succinctly respond to both.
All right. Hi, and thank you again, Lior and Sandra, Tonya, and Chris for such a great session so far. My question was a little bit more on the strategies to involve more engagement with workers. So I just wanted to know from your perspective, how do you think corporate sustainability strategies can evolve to include more engagement opportunities with workers or with our workforce? And do you see any trends or like tools or platforms that you think are kind of having some uptake or that your organizations are interested in?
Great.
So I'm happy to kind of try and tackle both really quickly. So I think on the ESG piece, it's one where we need, it's an ongoing conversation and education. I think everyone is learning and everyone's trying to get comfortable with how to manage the narrative and how to appropriately substantiate that narrative in a way that we can report against year over year. And so I think with us being a public company, we're more comfortable than perhaps non-public companies when it comes to telling that story in that kind of reporting way. And then it really comes down to communication. I think people are platformed out. There's lots of things, and when there's too much, people don't do anything, and they kind of go back to the old-fashioned way of wanting to pick up a phone or knock on someone's door, which we can't do right now. So that's presenting a little bit of a challenge. But I think again, it comes back to having an ongoing conversation. What we've learned is you can't just show up at one meeting, talk about why this is important, and then walk away and then expect the business to be able to navigate it, or expect our employees to be able to navigate that you have to have an ongoing conversation. And my favorite thing is to build awareness through engagement is kind of one of my mantras. And so I would say that's true for the various business areas as well as the employees, and then could further translate into the stakeholder and customer community as well.
Great. Sandra, anything to add there?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of how to build internal support for ESG or corporate responsibility programs, I think there's 4 things, and there are actually 4 things in some cases that are generic to having impact and influence on any cause that you want to push in a large company. So number 1 is you need to understand the business, because you need to, corollary is that you need to be able to know what's in it for them. So why should they care about this? You need to understand what they worry about. And I always frame it in terms of what a conversation about risks, returns, reputation, usually one or more of those buckets of framing it for the person or the group you're trying to convince will tell you what you need to know to pitch it to them. And then the other piece on it, again, always a useful thing is bring in external experts. So if you can have somebody who's semi-recognizable or even not recognizable, but has a lot of knowledge, a title, and obviously agrees with the position you're trying to push, get reinforcements to support you in getting people to care. And then strategies to include more employment with workers. I think, again, I would say there's three things. If you're in a medium or large company, you should get HR involved, because human resources could look at this as like employee engagement could be part of talent retention, part of the story about attracting talent. It could be a way to reward employees that are high potential, et cetera, even in a small company. So try to get an HR buddy to support you on that. Also look at skills-based volunteering. It's, people, and this is something we've discovered, IT professionals, in their spare time, especially when everyone's stuck in their house right now, maybe they want to build websites for small businesses or charities that need help, whatever. So, and that's an example of something we did, but skills-based volunteering is something to look at and gives you ideas. And then the third thing is we're just about to launch Benevity, which is it's a Canadian company that has a platform for charitable giving and volunteering. I don't even know how the volunteering part's going to work, but I'm told it's going to do everything except toast my breakfast bread. So I'm pretty sure there's applications that can help you coordinate those things as well.
If I could just jump back in and pick up on Sandra's theme. I know we're at time, but that is your first point. I think they're all brilliant. The first point is if what you're trying to do is only going to live in the CSR sustainability corner of the business, it will die there. And I don't mean to be so dramatic.
It's true.
It really does have to be an enabler of the overall business strategy. And if you're disconnected from that, then it will fail there. And if you are not genuine and authentic, people will call you out on it. So those were all really great and succinct, Sandra.
Yeah, great additions.
Yeah, thanks,
there,
Tonya.
Yeah, and thank you both. Chris, let me give you the last word, and then we'll wrap it up.
Well, I think both questions are fantastic, Haley and Hiroshi, and I think to try and put them together, this is the multi-stakeholder world that we've been talking about for a couple of decades, right? That all these different audiences and stakeholders matter. And I think the ESG conversation naturally is driven by the investor shift, especially the passive asset managers like the BlackRock and the Larry Fink letter, which I think is such an, we all know about it, but it's such an iconic event in the history of ESG that it'll be remembered historically as something that really did kind of catalyze stuff. But all of that is preceded by science and the reality. And I think the reality and the numbers investors gobble up. And that's part of what's been happening, I think, in the investor conversation. We see the risks have been magnified, they're clear, and the valuations have changed, and it's gone through the system. But we also have NGOs that are, before the pandemic, were getting much more engaged and activated. I think of Extinction Rebellion as the new activist approach to civil society, much more potent and in your face than Greenpeace even. So I think they are extending the type of movements that we're seeing. If we're talking about the decade of action that the UN has called, I think we can also say it'll be a decade of activism. As soon as COVID done, it's going to be an explosive moment. And we've seen it on the social side with Black Lives Matter in a positive way. So we have a civil society piece of the puzzle, and then we have consumers who are we're half in or half out and we're confused. We've got customers or enterprise customers that are demanding more stuff, and procurement is changing. And we have employees who are all those things, right? We're consumers, we're investors, we're shareholders, we're also supporters of NGOs. And all of those different stakeholder audiences are working together for the first time in 30 years of sort of understanding this in the same direction. Not perfectly, not fluidly, but the gears on the watch are all turning around, and the sand has diminished and there's less friction. Before there was counterpoints, right? That there were NGOs wanted to go this way, investors wanted to go the other way, consumers or governments were in different directions. We have this watch that is for the first time beginning to purr in one direction, and it's going to ratchet it up. So we're in a really interesting time and a momentous time to shift towards this. And we've got just enough time to do it, right? The clock is ticking unrelentingly, and we might just be able to get over the hump if we do this quickly.
Right. Isn't that the blessing and the wish that we all know? May you live in interesting times as we do. I'd like to take this moment to thank our speakers, Chris Coulter from GlobeScan, Sandra Odendahl from Scotiabank, and Tonya Lagrasta from Loblaw. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Haley and Hiroshi, for adding your questions into the mix. I know there's a lot of chatter in the chat box, which is fantastic to see. What we're going to do is we're going to stop the recording in a moment and leave the chat a little bit longer. If any of the speakers can just take a couple of minutes just to see any last minute questions, and if you're able to respond, then great. I understand if you need to run to another meeting, but I'll leave that open a little bit longer. Feel free to share your questions and any sort of outgoing thoughts as you sign out here. We'll leave that a couple of minutes there. I know many of you found us and this webinar through our newsletter. Thank you so much for subscribing. If you're not already subscribed, please do so you can find out about our upcoming webinars, and we've got a number of them planned. This is a bit of a sort of microcosm of what we do when we bring together leading companies to have in-depth conversation on important topics. And if you are so inclined to become a CBSR member, we'd love to have you. Feel free to contact us, visit our website if you want more information about that. On that note, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.